he sent it. We have to understand we're going to be on a continuum, and we don't know 3 months from today. That's when school opens up. And again, I understand everyone's deep concern to get ready, and the work that has to be done to get ready, but it is a quarter of a year from now. It's 3 months from today. So we don't know, honestly, will there be a vaccine? I don't think there'll be a vaccine in 3 months, but I don't know. And I would love nothing more. I think we all would. Will the disease have receded greatly? Will the disease have reasserted? Will our efforts to contain the disease continue to succeed? You know, what we don't know all of the issues that will face us. So it's impossible, it's literally, Andrew, impossible to say, here's exactly what's going to happen on September 10th, 2020. But what we do know is our schools need to be able to move on a continuum. The better the health situation, the more parents are ready to have their kids come back, the more students we have to be ready to serve in person. On the other side of the spectrum, God forbid we have a situation with the disease where we have to be ready to serve students more and more remotely. So, Andrew, the import of the letter to me was to say, hey everyone, this is going to be tough, but be ready to be someplace on a continuum. It could be every single student back in school. It could be no students back in school. We have to be ready for all of that at any point. It could change literally month to month because of the realities we face, going up or down. I know that's not easy for anyone to hear, but it's true. So what the chancellor is saying to all the leaders of our schools, and I want to thank all of our principals, assistant principals, all the administrators, all the educators who are trying to make sense of this great unknown, is we have to be ready for any eventuality. Andrew, we also know there's going to be a certain number of parents that even if school is open to all in person, they're not going to be ready necessarily on September 10th to send their child back. And I think there's going to take time for parents in some cases to feel comfortable. Others, I think, will be ready in the beginning. So plan A remains. We want the greatest number of kids in person. Let me make it really clear. The plan A is the greatest possible number of kids in person in school buildings. It must be safe. It must be safe for kids, families, educators, folks who work in the school buildings, everyone. But we know that remote learning is not as good as in-person learning. So if we can make it safe, and we really believe we can, we have a lot of testing, we have a lot of precautions, the more kids in school being taught by a teacher in person, the better. But some parents won't be ready. And so we're going to have a remote element for anyone who's not yet ready to send their child back. We understand this is an extraordinary moment in history. So, Andrew, plan A remains maximum number of kids in school, always have the remote option available for those who need it, and then we will adjust according to the realities. What's your next question?
To do with the incident involving the young man, Jamel Leach, in the Bronx. I know you spoke to the family yesterday, but my question is, how quickly will there be some kind of an action taken involving the police in this case? You had vowed that one of the lessons learned in the wake of all these protests is much swifter action. So how swift will the action be?
Yeah, I want to see an investigation done in a matter of days. I'm not going to say exactly, one day or another, but days. And I expect the model going forward to be one that focuses on speed and transparency. We have a great boost now on transparency now that the 50A law has been changed. But what we've got to get to, and we will, is making sure NYPD does these investigations promptly, comes back with results promptly, and we make them public promptly. And then there's consequences that they happen promptly. So this one, I met the young man. I met his family. I'm very concerned. I want to make sure we get the truth, and I want to make sure we follow through based on what the facts tell us. And we'll have more to say on that in the next few days.
The next is Jillian from WBAI.
Hi, Mr. Mayor.
Hey, Jillian, how you doing?
Following up on, I'm okay. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Following up on last week's question about over-policing in communities of color and surveillance. Last month, 42 civil rights and nonprofit groups wrote Speaker Johnson urging him to pass the Public Oversight and Surveillance Technology, or POST Act, which has been languishing. creating a system of oversight over the NYPD's use of military-grade equipment, which tracks people and listens in on calls, things like that. Because the department hasn't released information about this equipment and how and where it's being used. So this isn't about community policing per se. Do you support passage of the Post Act?
So I have to see the language, Jillian. Look, here's what I do support. I want maximum transparency within the context of dealing with real and very, very challenging security dynamics. Remember, we're very focused right now on the issues that are facing the city here and now. But that does not mean the challenges we faced for years and years in terms of terrorism have gone away. They just haven't. And that poses a real threat to the people of this city. So we have to strike a balance, as in all things. I want maximum transparency, but not transparency to the point that it undermines the valid need to keep people safe. We got to figure out what that balance is. We obviously have tremendous legal oversight and proper legal restrictions to make sure that ability to gain information is handled appropriately. The other thing is, you saw in the approach we took here in this city, I was adamant that we should not have the National Guard in New York City. We should not have military in New York City. We should not be using the kinds of techniques and equipment that some other cities have used, most notably and tragically years ago, Ferguson, but many others. The rubber bullets, the tear gas, the different equipment that just doesn't belong in a setting where we're trying to protect civilians' right to protest. And I'm very interested in making sure we understand, the public understands exactly what the NYPD has and doesn't have, again, within the context of appropriate security issues, because we don't want to fall into that situation where a police force that's meant to be about civilian work ever acts in a military fashion. I think this whole country, Jillian, was jolted by seeing the president try and bring the armed forces into a moment of civilian protest. I think people were repulsed by it. And it's a good moment for us all to take stock and say, we need to make sure our police forces are never militarized in their approach. So I look forward to all of that being addressed. But as to legislation, I need to see the specifics before I can give you an answer.
The next is Shant from the Daily News.
Did she have a follow or not?
Good.
Trey, did she have a follow or not?
I'm sorry, Jillian, did you have a follow-up? Jillian, you're on.
I had a second question.
Yeah,
I'm
go
sorry
ahead.
about that.
Sorry, Jillian.
Okay, thanks. No problem. I'm surprised from yesterday's briefing about your admitted lack of knowledge of the Cure Violence movement, since Mayor Dinkins was such a proponent of his Increase the Peace Corps, which was so effective and similar in mission. How are these two substantively different?
Well, Jillian, I'm trying to be accurate in my memory, but I feel like it was, because you're talking about an administration ended in 1993, and a lot of what I at least have experienced in terms of the Cure Violence movement and the crisis management system really emerges in the city years after that. So of course, Mayor Dinkins was trying to focus on youth programs. He was trying to focus on community empowerment, and I was proud, and Charlene was proud to be a part of all that. But I think I'm on firm ground saying that the modern approach to cure violence in this city emerged substantially later. And that movement, as I got to know it, the more I experienced it, the more I believed it was the way forward. And you saw some of the leaders of that movement and the power of what they're doing. I think this is a great example that the city government needs to provide direct support more and more to the Cure Violence movement and the crisis management system to let this powerful movement create peace at the community level, empower communities, create community grassroots leadership. This is really the way forward. The more we do of that, the more effectively we do that, the more we change the reality of policing in this city. So that's where I'm going to be committed. But I think in the past, there were very kindred approaches, but I think this approach is more particular to recent years.
Shant from the Daily News.
Good morning, everyone. If I could direct my questions to First Lady McRae, had one kind of policy question, one kind of politics one. On the policy side, can you give details on how the restaurants are being selected for the $3 million? And on the politics side, I think this is the third time this week that you've appeared at a press conference with the mayor. You're getting a very high profile role in the city's coronavirus response. But critics out there say that this is essentially to help elevate your profile ahead of a possible run for Brooklyn Borough President next year. What would be your comment on that? Thank you.
I'm going to just jump in procedurally, and then the First Lady will go. That on the first question, in addition to the First Lady, Toya Williford will talk about the details. And the second point, I'm just going to make a very, very broad statement of fact. And Sean, I don't think you were covering City Hall in the beginning of the administration. I remember in the first days of the administration when I said that my closest advisor was our First Lady, and the person I turned to in making the most important decisions, the personnel decisions, the key policy decisions. And she was going to play a profoundly foundational role in this administration. She and I have built all of this together from day one, going back to when I ran for school board in Brooklyn in 1999. So I don't think you necessarily saw and heard that all in real time, but that's been the reality from day one, the prominence of her role. I think there's been critics from the beginning, and people were uncomfortable with that from the beginning. I don't know if they were uncomfortable because she was a woman. I don't know uncomfortable because she is an African American, or because she is an African American woman, or the notion that someone who has strong views and progressive views is playing such an important role. I don't know what was motivating the critics, but this has been the fact from day one, long before she even considered anything in terms of public office. So I just want to set that record straight, and with that, turn to the First Lady.
Thank you, Bill. Sean, I don't know what the future holds for me. I'm a volunteer in this administration, and everything that I do is because I care deeply about the people that we serve. And I wanted to be a part of this administration in a way that would contribute to helping people live better lives. Again, I don't know what the future holds for me. I'm not someone who thrives in the limelight. I don't need the attention of being in front of the cameras. In fact, it's very difficult for me. I do what I do because I care about people. I care deeply about these brown and black communities that have been affected disproportionately by the COVID-19 virus. And I feel like it's my duty, it's my obligation as someone who has privilege, who has been given a lot, to do what I can to make things better. And that's why I get up every morning. I ask myself this morning, why am I doing this? Bill can testify to that. Why am I doing this? And sitting here listening to Toya, listening to Deputy Mayor Thompson about what we're doing for these young people who need to have these opportunities, for these restaurant owners who are suffering so deeply, it really means the world to me. I sleep well at night knowing that we've done as much as we can to move the needle forward. And I get up every morning knowing that we've got to move it even more. So I hope that answers your question.
And Toya, you want to speak about the details?
Absolutely. So restaurant owners who want to apply and access this program, the Restaurant Revitalization Program, which will again start with 100 restaurants. This is a launch pad moving forward. That application can be found at nyc.gov/opportunity. All of the program details and the application can be accessed at that URL. This program will be overseen by the Mayor's Office for Economic Opportunity and will be administered in partnership with the Human Resources Administration, HRA.
Thank you. Go ahead.
The next is Kathleen from Patch.
Hi, Mr. Mayor. Can you hear me?
Yes, Kathleen, how you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Good, thank you.
So I wanted to talk to you about NYCHA for a moment. Right now, there are 28 buildings and nearly 5,000 residents who don't have hot water today. It's not the first time in the past week. It's not the second. I wondered what you would say to those residents, many of whom live in high-risk areas for COVID-19 and have been told the most important thing they can do to protect themselves is to wash their hands.
Yeah, Kathleen, I'm very saddened, really saddened anytime this happens. I mean, we are in a situation where we have got to do everything we possibly can to help the residents of public housing. And you know, we've been doing a lot to specifically address health concerns, whether it's the repeated cleanings in the NYCHA buildings, the free face coverings, the air conditioners for older residents who might be endangered by the heat. We're obviously food programs. There's so much we have to do to keep addressing the health needs of people in public housing and to keep addressing the overall challenge of how to fix our public housing buildings. And obviously, as we get through this pandemic, we're going to go right back to deepening that work. But every time the hot water is out, it personally drives me crazy because I feel for the residents who are going through that. And I know the buildings are, in many cases, really, you know, they've been without investment for decades and decades. I know how hard it is for the folks who work at NYCHA to keep them going. But all I can say is, Kathleen, you know, we learned on the issue of heat that we could do a lot of things differently and that we could speed up the way we address heat. I'll find out today how quickly we can get the hot water back, and if there's anything we need to do structurally to, you know, stop these breakdowns from happening, or at least repair them more quickly, because I don't want people going without hot water ever, especially, as you say, in the middle of a pandemic. So we'll have an update for you in the next few hours about how quickly we can fix that.
Kathleen, do you have a follow-up?
Oh, yes. I wondered if you could respond to Sergeant McCrory's comment on why officers aren't wearing masks. She spoke to the New York Times and suggested that 15 hours of wearing bulletproof vests, helmets, and masks while policing in summer heat was too much to demand.
I think she is raising a real concern, but I don't think it negates the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic and we need all public servants to wear face coverings to the maximum extent possible. Look, let's be fair. There are times when, if you're drinking water or you're giving an instruction to a group of people, there are times where it is appropriate to take off a mask. If you're not within 6 feet of anyone, there are definitely exceptions. But overwhelmingly, people need to have face coverings on. Every single public servant, that includes our police officers. The commissioner has made it very, very clear in his directives to officers that they have to do this, and that it's a matter of discipline if people don't. Again, there are exceptions. I want to be fair about that. Yes, Sergeant's not wrong that it's been hot and long hours and difficult conditions. No one that I know enjoys wearing a face covering. But it is so important that the people of the city see the people they look to enforce the law actually abiding by the same rules as the rest of us. And so that has to happen to the absolute maximum extent possible among our police officers as well.
Next is Henry from Bloomberg.
Hello, Mr. Mayor. My question has to do with the budget. Yesterday, you announced this $10 million Cure Violence campaign. And throughout the several weeks, you've talked about various programs that'll cost several million here, several million there. Are these additive programs, additive to a budget that's already reeling from a fiscal crisis, or are you going to be shifting money from one department into another department? And if so, why don't you explain to us how you're finding money for these programs and what's going on with the budget?
Yeah, Henry, obviously I'm going to start by explaining now, and then the ultimate explanation will come in just over 2 weeks when we put together with the council the final budget. We have two giant X factors. I'm just going to say it for the sake of clarity: the stimulus and the potential of borrowing authority from Albany. Both of those very open questions right now. What we're going to do is prioritize. We may well have to make some very, very difficult choices with the council in the next few weeks. But we're saying that the things we are talking about are priorities no matter what. They are additive in the sense that they will be new directions that the city government will take, and they will be part of the budget no matter what else is done in the budget. Some of the cases you heard today are paid for with other resources, whether they're existing funds being moved to these purposes because the previous initiatives couldn't happen in the context of the coronavirus. So some is reutilization of existing funds. Some is outside money, as you heard from Toya. But mostly what we will do is say if something is a priority, like cure violence, we will make it a priority, we will find the money, and we will have to make appropriate actions to take from the whole rest of the budget to make it happen because we regard it as that much of a priority. But in terms of how we're going to readjust the budget, we have to have an absolute answer on stimulus and borrowing to know if those pieces will have any role in the budget by the end of this month. And if they are not, then we have to construct a budget that is able to get us balanced while still leaving room for the possibility of that relief coming later. And in that scenario where there is no relief, Henry, we're going to make very tough choices that literally every single agency will be affected. Every single agency will have to sacrifice in that environment. But we're still able to say there are some things we now have decided are so important that they're going to happen no matter what other sacrifices we have to make. Go ahead, Henry.
Okay, I just want to follow up on this because, as you know, or I hope you know, the Citizens Budget Commission put out a report where they had several recommendations. Attriting the workforce was one of them. Selling off some city assets was another idea. Shifting some of the police responsibilities to civilian actions, which would possibly cost less. And they came up with, something like, I'm going to be generalizing, about $2.5 billion in recurring savings that could help the budget in future years. Have you looked at this? Is this something you could do? It would require some very painstaking looks at agencies' internal operations. It would take some work, but it would save money in their view.
Thank you, Henry. Henry, I respect the Citizens Budget Commission. I don't always agree with them, but I do respect them. I'm not someone who believes in an ideology of austerity. I want to make that very clear. I think that ideology has been negative, has been regressive, whether it was tried in this city, in this country, or all over the world. I come from an ideology that believes in the power of government investment, but I also believe in balancing budgets. So we always listen to the ideas from the Citizens Budget Commission, but we don't necessarily share their philosophical view. But the work you described, that painstaking work, that's done every single day by Melanie Hartzog, our budget director, and everyone at OMB. That's literally what they do all year round. And we look at anything that we think could save money. You've seen billions saved in recent years because of that painstaking work. And we're going to look at anything and everything, I assure you, in this budget process. Civilianization, one of the things you mentioned, I think is very, very powerful option. I have supported civilianization within the NYPD going back to when I was a city council member. We've done a very substantial amount of civilianization. It has worked. I want to give a special shout out to Henry Garrido and everyone at DC 37 AFSCME that have been pushing civilianization of the NYPD for probably about 20 years. They were right. We did a lot of it. It was fine. It worked well. We're going to look to see if we can do more. But on the other issues, attrition, selling off assets, that is very much determined by what the real outcome would be. You sell off an asset that has long-term impact on the city, you could be doing something that's penny wise and pound foolish. Attrition too, what would be the impact of the attrition? What would be the impact on human lives when we're in the middle of a pandemic? It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all, Henry. But I can tell you one thing, within 2 weeks, we will have a balanced budget no matter how tough the decisions are. I know how to make these decisions. I know how to make the tough decisions, the tough cuts. But it will reflect priorities. and the need to invest where the need is greatest and to address the disparities that we've seen in this crisis.
The next is Gersh from Streets Blog.
Hello, Mr. Mayor. How are you?
Good, Gersh. How you doing?
I'm great. I have a question following up on yesterday. You were asked about getting the NYPD out of traffic enforcement, and you said you were talking about that. But today, the executive directors of Transportation Alternatives and the Brooklyn Movement Center had a Gotham Gazette op-ed calling for the NYPD to get out of more than just traffic enforcement, but to get police out of enforcing public space because of the NYPD's statistically documented racial bias in public space enforcement. The op-ed actually said, and I'm quoting this, "It's time to stop spending so much money on practices that harm people of color." So what do you think about getting the NYPD out of public space enforcement as well as traffic enforcement?
Well, I think the whole concept, Gersh, of public space enforcement, I'm happy in your follow-on you can educate me more, but I would say you just said a very, very broad category there. I don't want to see the NYPD involved in street vendor enforcement, for example. That's something the task force recommended that we're putting into action immediately. And I think there's other areas where civilian efforts would be better. We made that decision on social distancing as well. We're going to keep looking at that, and we're going to look at it with the council as well. If it hasn't been changed, it should be immediately. Rich, I will join you in not knowing enough about what's going on in Fort Hamilton. Obviously, the city doesn't run Fort Hamilton, the federal government does, but nothing should be named after Robert E. Lee at this point in history. And by the way, he is someone who was supposed to follow his oath to the United States of America and the United States military and didn't. So on top of his many other sins and on top of the racism that he stood for. So no, of course, helpful. In terms of day-to-day operations, day-to-day work.
Fort Hamilton over a street that was named after Robert E. Lee when he served as an engineer there before the Civil War. And I'm wondering whether do you know anything about whether or not that street name has ever been changed, and what would you think about having it changed if it has not been?
If it hasn't been changed, it should be immediately. Rich, I will join you in not knowing enough about what's going on in Fort Hamilton. Obviously, the city doesn't run Fort Hamilton, the federal government does, but nothing should be named after Robert E. Lee at this point in history. And by the way, he is someone who was supposed to follow his oath to the United States of America and the United States military and didn't. So on top of his many other sins and on top of the racism that he stood for. So no, of course, anything named after him has to go in the city. I don't know if there still is one there. If there is, we'll appeal to the military to immediately remove it.
Can I say something?
Please, Deputy Mayor. That, again, I think I spoke to this yesterday. Department of Homeland Security officers who work with the NYPD on issues like human trafficking, not ICE that works on illegitimate immigration enforcement. And I'm someone who believes ICE should be abolished, repeal and replace ICE, start over, and create an agency that actually does appropriate immigration enforcement and has an entirely different attitude and a humane attitude towards the people who try to come to this country or do come to this country. So I have no use for ICE. ICE is not allowed on city property, et cetera. Homeland Security does other things than ICE. If, in fact, anyone from ICE per se was involved, I need to know that exactly. That is unacceptable. There will be consequences for that. I need to know that. I have no